How could the world's most powerful military struggle against a small Southeast Asian nation? For nearly 20 years, the United States poured billions of dollars, advanced weapons, and over 2.7 million troops into Vietnam. Yet in 1975, the war ended not in victory, but in withdrawal. So what went wrong? This is the story of why the United States couldn't win the Vietnam War. To understand the war, we must go back to the end of World War II. Vietnam had been a French colony for decades. But after Japan's defeat in 1945, a nationalist and communist leader named Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam independent. France desperately tried to regain control but ultimately failed. In 1954, the Geneva Accords temporarily divided Vietnam into two parts, the communist North Vietnam and the anti-communist South Vietnam. The division was meant to be temporary, with nationwide elections planned to reunify the country. But those elections never happened, setting the stage for a long and brutal conflict. The United States feared something called the Domino theory. If Vietnam became communist, Washington believed other Southeast Asian countries would fall one by one, like a row of dominoes. So, America began supporting South Vietnam with money and military advisors. After the controversial Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, U.S. involvement escalated dramatically. President Lyndon B. Johnson authorized a massive military buildup. Soon, hundreds of thousands of American troops were fighting in the dense, unfamiliar jungles of Vietnam. But this was not a conventional war with clear front lines. The Viet Cong, communist guerrilla fighters operating in the south, used unconventional tactics. They knew the terrain intimately. They blended in with the civilian population, making it impossible to tell friend from foe. They built vast, sophisticated underground tunnel systems to hide, move troops, and launch surprise attacks. For American soldiers, the war was a constant struggle against ambushes, booby traps, and an enemy that was often invisible. Superior firepower and technology meant little in this kind of dense jungle warfare. The turning point came in 1968, during the Vietnamese New Year celebration known as Tet. North Vietnam and the Viet Cong launched a massive, coordinated series of attacks on cities and military bases all across South Vietnam, even striking the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was a failure for the communists, who suffered heavy losses. But psychologically, it was a devastating blow to the United States. Americans at home had been repeatedly told by their leaders that the war was nearly won. The shocking images from Tet proved that wasn't true. Public confidence in the war effort collapsed. Back in the United States, the country was deeply divided. For the first time, television brought the brutal reality of war directly into American living rooms every night. Graphic footage of combat, rising American casualties, and the controversial military draft fueled a powerful anti-war movement. College campuses became centers of protest, and massive demonstrations filled the streets. The war was no longer just a conflict in Vietnam. It was tearing American society apart from within. The U.S. government faced a brutal reality. North Vietnam, fighting for national unification on its own soil, was willing to endure enormous losses to achieve its goal. America, on the other hand, was fighting a costly war thousands of miles from home. Massive bombing campaigns like Operation Rolling Thunder failed to break North Vietnam's will to fight. Guerrilla warfare effectively neutralized America's technological superiority. And most importantly, political support for the war back home was fading fast. The longer the war dragged on, the clearer it became that a conventional military victory was impossible. In 1973, after years of painful negotiations, the United States signed the Paris Peace Accords and began withdrawing its combat troops. But the peace was short-lived, and fighting between North and South Vietnamese forces continued. Finally, on April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. The world watched as dramatic images of helicopters evacuating Americans from embassy rooftops were broadcast globally, a powerful symbol of America's defeat. Vietnam was finally unified, but under communist rule. The war had lasted nearly 2 decades. It cost the lives of over 58,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese soldiers and civilians. So why couldn't the United States win? Because this was never just a military conflict. It was a war of ideology and nationalism. It was a brutal guerrilla war fought in an unforgiving terrain. It was a war with unclear political objectives and a strategy that was poorly matched to the reality on the ground. And ultimately, it was a war that lost the support of the American people. Military power alone was not enough to win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people or sustain a prolonged fight without backing at home. The Vietnam War became one of the most important and painful lessons in modern history, a lesson about the limits of power, the complexities of foreign intervention, and the immense human cost of war. The Vietnam War changed global politics, reshaped US foreign policy, and left deep scars that are still felt today. History reminds us that power does not always guarantee victory. If you want more powerful and accurate historical stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow for more lessons from the past. Thanks for watching.